This is the largest and most prosperous country in the world. It occupies almost a quarter of the entire land area on Earth, 36 million square kilometers, more than the modern-day Russia, Alaska, and China combined. The almighty British Empire where the sun never sets. After all, it owns colonies on 5 continents with about 500 million people living on its territory. At least that's how it used to be, only it was 100 years ago. In its heyday, the British Empire had enormous political weight and was one of the strongest states. That is, unless it was in fact the strongest. English goods were of excellent quality and were sold in all corners of the world. And the Industrial Revolution in England in the 18th century turned the state into a leading economy, the so-called factory of the world. Great Britain was the major producer of textile, coal, steel, steamships, machine tools, and a lot more. The pound's share in international trade accounted for about 60% of the world trade. So it wasn't the dollar that ruled the market back in the day, it was the Great British Pound, which by the way was then backed up by gold, not the way things play out nowadays. And so, it's not at all surprising that London's becoming the financial capital of the world and the leader in terms of investment abroad. How did Great Britain manage to achieve such height? Why did it collapse, and how did it happen that from its once vast territories, all there's left now is a few islands and a couple of overseas territories? And how do they live today?
It is only right to explain why I am standing here as your new Prime Minister. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis.
Let's go back to the start of the 16th century. England is on the margins of Europe, lost Hundreds-Year War, lost all its possessions on the continent, and was exhausted by a 30-year civil war. Clearly, it is very far from being an advanced economic power. So, it's an island. There's water all around. Who on earth would even try to invade it? Well, at the beginning of the 16th century, England did not have a strong navy and was often raided by neighbors, Spain, France, and Holland. England could not compete with them simply because those were already strong maritime powers at the time. But after some 150 years, everything changed. To protect their own territory from constant attacks, the British built a fleet of warships. Now, where did they get the money? And what did the King Henry VII did? He introduced increased duty on the import of foreign goods into England. Thanks to this, in only 5 years, the British fleet will expand from 3 to 32 ships. Henry's son, Henry VIII, will successfully continue his father's work. After a quarrel with the Pope, he simply took and put up for sale the rich monasteries built all throughout England. The money received was invested in the construction of a large tonnage naval vessels and coastal forts. But the British fleet became indeed great only under Elizabeth I. In her times, Spain had the strongest fleet and didn't like the growing influence of the British in international trade at all. The Spaniards sent 130 ships to the shores of the foggy Albion. But the British won. How did they do it? Just like both Henriks before her, Elizabeth had found her own way of making money. She went as far as to legalize piracy in England. The well-known sea wolves like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Charles Howard were granted the right to rob foreign ships and merchant caravans. They were obliged to give part of the treasure to the British Treasury in exchange for immunity from prosecution. At the end of 16th century, the British surprised the world with their first dreadnought. It was the most powerful and the fastest sailing artillery ship of that time. This was the time when the British gained a serious advantage over their main competitors, Spain, France, and Holland. In 1701, a childless king dies in Spain. A war broke out in Europe due to inheritance disputes. There are only 2 applicants for a huge inheritance, the French and the Austrians. But the main benefit from the results of the war goes to the British. They got the monopoly right of the slave trade in America and North Africa, as well as Gibraltar, the key strait of world trade. This is when the Britain becomes a sea ruler and gains economic power. By the way, British are the founders of drug trade. It all started with the making of channels for opium sale from their Indian colonies to China, and ended with opium wars in which England defeated the Chinese fleet and imposed an enslaving terms of trade. And do you know what the secret of Britain's economic success really is? First of all, they always protected their market from foreign competition. Well, that is until the Americans came during the Second World War and took that opportunity away from them. Second of all, the British state came to their success by someone else's hand. How? Pretty easy. The development of new territories took place at the expense of private campaigns, not the public ones. English merchants, private entrepreneurs, adventurers, and pirates, that's who financed all military expeditions and managed new lands. Look, India was conquered by the East Indian Company, a community of private traders who had their own army. North America was colonized by a dozen different independent expeditions, and colonization of Africa was financially supported by the well-known Rothschilds. At the end of the 19th century, the government simply came and nationalized the property of all private companies to establish direct control over all territories. Isn't it beautiful and convenient? By the way, the development of the British Navy played a major role in the development of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and allowed for a military industry upgrade. At that time, ships and cities were built from wood. The population was growing and had to live somewhere warm and dry. All the meanwhile, there's less and less wood on the island. Do you remember the noble Robin Hood? In the Middle Ages, he hides along with his fans in the deep Sherwood forest. Well, by the beginning of the 18th century, almost all forests in the UK were cut right down for the purposes of the fleet and metallurgy development. The era of coal is on the rise, and there's a lot in England. The demand for coal is growing, and production is growing along with it. In the 18th century, England was already producing 3 million tons per year, and all of this stuff gets brought to the surface by the hands of people and with the help of animals. There was no machinery for it back then. This cute little pony was bred not at all for the good life and entertainment of children, but for hard work. There were almost 16,000 Shetland ponies working in England at that time. All their life, this little horse dragged a heavy trolley underground, inhaling coal dust and transporting up to 3,000 tons of coal per year. And what's the main problem when it comes to mines? Water. The deeper and larger the mine, the more water there's in it. And it must be pumped out somehow. And this is where new technology comes to rescue. In the middle of the 18th century, coal mines start to use the latest invention, a pump with the Newcomen steam engine. Already in 1782, James Watt made a more advanced version that would be used not only in mining, but also in transport and machine production. The mechanical loom, for example, completely changed the entire light industry. The machine that was invented and patented by Edmund Cartwright produced fabrics at a speed comparable to the work of 40 people. Generally, all industries continue to develop rapidly. They constantly deliver new raw materials to factories and transport finished products where those are in demand. The old methods of shipping goods were too slow and expensive. Everything changes when George Stephenson opens the world's first 40-kilometer rail line in 1825. And in the middle of the 19th century, 11,000 kilometers of railway lines are built in England. As a result, over the next 100 years, London turns into the richest and the largest city on Earth, with its population growing almost 7 times. In 1920, Great Britain is at the peak of its heyday in power, and 30 years old later, in 1947, Churchill said, "I watched this famous island descending incontinently." In August of the same year, Great Britain, under the pressure of the struggle for independence, is forced to grant freedom to the pearl of the British crown, India. In 1948, Burma and Ceylon embarked on an independent path of development. Same year, Britain, by decision of the UN General Assembly, was deprived of the mandate for Palestine. In its place, 2 independent states were created, an Arab state and a Jewish state. After which, by the way, a series of military conflicts started. But that's another story. In 1956, Great Britain was not able to recapture the Suez Canal from its then former colony Egypt, which it controlled for almost 100 years before. At that time, this vital waterway belonged to a British-French enterprise, and Egypt simply took and nationalized it. The British, of course, tried to resolve the issue by colluding with France and Israel, but their invasion was not appreciated by the UN, the USA, and the USSR. When the UN threatened sanctions and the International Monetary Fund promised to cut off Britain from financial assistance, Britain had to back down. As a result, the Suez Canal officially became the property of the Egyptian authorities, and it is still one of the main sources of income for the country. Now, why do you think all great empires fall apart sooner or later? As a general rule, everything's growing steadily. New territories bring new taxes and other useful acquisitions. The metropolis is pleased and proud of its greatness. But as the business grows, so do the costs. At a minimum, money is necessary for development, a lot of it. And where do you get the money? Well, you can raise taxes, for example, and reduce expenses for the needs of civilians, but the population is very unlikely to appreciate it. And then, there are neighbors and competitors around who are ready to set fire to anything you own. This means the need to increase military power. A vicious circle, really. UK had the same problem. Managing vast territories and 500 million people was incredibly expensive. Back in 1880, the British Empire brought economic returns lower than investments in Britain itself. At that time, British taxpayers paid 2.5 times more than citizens of other developed countries to preserve it. The scattered territories all over the world and the huge volume of world trade required constant monitoring and protection of numerous sea routes. And if British army successfully coped with the natives and a bunch of pirates, then it was much more difficult and expensive to compete with similar industrial powers. Great Britain is no longer a great world power, and it will never be again, says British former Prime Minister John Major, who came after Margaret Thatcher in the early 1990s. And two big wars will be to blame for everything, in which Great Britain was a world leader, could not help but participate. Britain was still the most important country in the world at that time, and whether it wants it or not, it has to defend its interests around the globe. It emerged from the First World War among the victorious countries, for example the colonies of the defeated Turkey, the former Ottoman Empire, and Germany will mostly go to it. But in the end, this war will cost us beyond its means. The total cost of the war amounted to about £11 billion, and taxes increased 6 times during the war. The country was able to cover only a third of military expenses with taxes, and the rest had to be borrowed. Britain, like France, accepted aid from the United States, and its debt increased 12 times during the war years. In particular, England owes the United States about $5 billion. That's how England turned from a creditor country into a debtor. The British economy also deteriorated considerably during the First World War. National wealth was reduced by half, industrial production by 20%, and export of goods fell by almost half. The industrial structure was skewed towards military products. The technical equipment was no longer functional. At the same time, new industries developed very slowly, and production volumes are very low. The new blood of the economy, oil, was not available to the UK at that time, and it depended on imports of black gold from the United States and the Middle East. As a result, for the first time in 300 years, England lost economic primacy to the United States, and the world financial capital moved from London to New York, and the Second World War finally finished off the empire.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
German planes bomb London, destroy other British cities and factories, and maritime logistics are disrupted, thanks to German submarines. The threat of invasion by Nazi troops loomed over the metropolis. Military spending is rising, and there's a shortage of labor, fuel, and vehicles. During the war, Great Britain lost 25% of its national wealth, and industrial production decreased by 10%. There were even food stamps in the country, which could only be cancelled in 1953. During the war, England had to ask for help again, obviously from the United States. A special land-lease program according to which you could get tanks, ships, shells, and planes now and pay later. A familiar model, right? The total cost of Lend-Lease arms supplies to England is estimated at about $20.8 billion, for which the UK will have to pay up to 2006. But that's not all. The Americans forced it. The British signed an agreement, the Atlantic Charter, according to which the United States gained access to ports and free trade zone in the territories of the British colonies. After that, the colonies became a nuisance for the British authorities because instead of English goods at prices imposed from London, American ones were much cheaper. As a result, Britain lost its main advantage, unlimited power over the colonies. Imagine, 27 colonies becoming independent in 36 years. The era of empire ended in 1997, when Hong Kong officially returns to the bosom of China.
The British flag will be lowered, and British administrative responsibility will end.
Now, of course, England is still trying to seem like a leading world power. At one time, Queen Elizabeth II actively tried to unite the former colonies around her, the famous Commonwealth of Nations. London still controls not only the British Isles, but also the overseas territories, of which there are 14, mostly offshore islands in the Caribbean. The country is one of the 5 members of the UN Security Council. Despite the fact that the British Empire is no longer there, traces of its influence still remain both in England and around the world. English is an international language, and for 20% of people in the world, it is generally their native language. And that's not surprising at all, because the blood of the British today flows in tens of millions of modern people. In 1952, Great Britain became the nuclear weapons state and launched the first jet passenger aircraft in the world. British scientists received Nobel Prizes for their contribution to the invention of a lithium-ion battery, the one you can find in any modern-day smartphone. Also, English software engineers will send the world's first SMS. England gave the world football, Harry Potter, the Magnificent Four from Liverpool, and make the most luxurious cars in the world, Rolls-Royce. That's right, Britain was one of the mistresses of the seas and the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Today, the United Kingdom ranks 78th in the world in terms of area, 21st in terms of population, and the country's economy is no longer number 1. It's number 10 in terms of GDP and purchasing power. At the same time, they suffer high inflation, about 10%, and almost 90% of the population lives below the poverty line. They're struggling with record inflation, the healthcare system is deteriorating, public transport is stalling due to endless strikes, and there's not enough workers in the post-Brexit labor market. Back in 1962, the United States President advisor Dean Acheson said, "Britain has lost its empire and has not found a new role in the world." The role that Britain found in recent years may exclude the country from the list of leading world powers. According to forecasts of financial gurus, by 2030 Poland will become richer than Britain, and by 2040 the economies of all countries of the European continent will surely overtake the kingdom. But let's not speculate on that, because only time will tell.